man who would forge China from chaos was born in the city of his enemies, surrounded by people who would have killed him in his cradle had they known what he would become. In the year 259 BC, in the capital of the state of Zhao, a child drew his first breath in a world that had known nothing but war for 200 years. His mother was a former dancer. His father was a hostage prince. And somewhere in the shadows, a merchant was calculating the profit that this infant might one day yield. China in the 3rd century BC was not China at all. It was a bleeding wound stretched across the map. 7 kingdoms had been locked in slaughter for generations, their borders drawn and redrawn in blood. The Zhou dynasty still claimed the mandate of heaven, but real power belonged to warlord states that had already consumed millions of lives in their struggle for supremacy. Qin dominated the west. Chu sprawled across the south, and between them, the kingdoms of Han, Wei, Zhao, Yan, and Qi fought and schemed and died. Into this world of perpetual war, the future emperor arrived with nothing but the circumstances of his birth to mark him for destiny. His father, Prince Zichu, had drawn the shortest straw among the sons of the Qin royal house. As a minor prince with little prospect of inheritance, he had been sent to Zhao as a diplomatic hostage, a human guarantee of Qin's good behavior. Such arrangements were common among the warring states, a grim commerce in royal flesh. Zichu lived in Handan, not as a guest, but as a prisoner. His life forfeit the moment relations between Qin and Zhao turned violent. The young prince had resigned himself to obscurity when a merchant named Lu Buwei looked upon him and saw not a forgotten hostage, but an investment opportunity unlike any other. Lu Buwei had built his fortune through trade, but above all, he understood that the greatest profits came from the rarest commodities. And what could be rarer than a kingdom? The merchant studied the Qin succession and recognized that Zichu, despite his misery, sat closer to the throne than his circumstances suggested. The crown prince's favorite concubine had produced no sons. With the right connections and sufficient gold, a forgotten hostage might become an heir. A rare commodity, indeed. Lu Buwei reportedly told Zichu when he proposed his scheme. The profit from this investment would be incalculable. Gold flowed to the Qin court, purchasing ministers and eunuchs who whispered Zichu's name in the right ears. The campaign succeeded beyond expectation. The childless concubine formally adopted the hostage prince as her own son, catapulting him from prisoner to designated heir of the Qin throne. But Lu Buwei's most consequential gift to Zichu was not gold or influence. It was a woman. Lady Zhao had been the merchant's concubine, a dancer whose beauty and intelligence made her far more than an ornament. When Zichu expressed desire for her, Lu Buwei made his calculation and let her go. Some accounts suggest she was already pregnant with Lu Buwei's child when she entered Zichu's household. Others insist the timing made such conception impossible. The truth vanished into palace whispers, leaving behind only a question that would haunt the future emperor. Whose son was he really? The child born to Lady Zhao in 259 BC received the name Yingzheng. He entered the world as the son of a hostage prince in enemy territory, his existence precarious from his first breath. Zhao and Qin were locked in a rivalry that regularly erupted into warfare, and the citizens of Handan had little love for anything connected to the Western Kingdom that had slaughtered their fathers and brothers on countless battlefields. Yingzheng's earliest years were spent in the shadow of that hatred. He learned to walk in a city where his family name was a curse. He learned to speak, knowing that the wrong word could mean death. The boy absorbed, in the wordless way that children understand danger, that he was surrounded by enemies. When Ying Zheng was 6 years old, that precarious tolerance ended. Qin armies descended upon Zhao with a ferocity that surpassed even the brutal standards of the age. As Handan starved under siege, its citizens began looking for someone to blame. Zichu escaped through bribery and Lu Buwei's connections, slipping away with the merchant's gold smoothing his path. But Lady Zhao and her young son were left behind, abandoned to face the wrath of a city dying by inches. Mother and child went into hiding, moving between safe houses as Zhao officials searched for hostages to execute. How they survived those desperate months, whether through family connections, bribery, or sheer luck, history does not record. It preserves only the fact of their survival and the scars it left behind. Ying Zheng remained trapped in Zhao for years afterward, a forgotten child in an enemy city, while his father's prospects rose in distant Qin. Only when Ying Zheng was 9 years old did circumstances finally allow his return. His grandfather, King Zhaoxiang, had died after 56 years on the throne. Zichu's own father ruled briefly, then died within 3 days. Zichu ascended as King Zhuangxiang of Qin, and suddenly the forgotten boy in Handan became crown prince of the most powerful state in China. The child who arrived in the Qin capital of Xianyang bore little resemblance to princes raised in palaces. Where they had learned courtly graces, he had learned survival. Where they had absorbed the confidence of security, he had developed the watchfulness of prey. But Ying Zheng found a kingdom that matched his temperament. Qin was different from the other warring states, deliberately, ruthlessly different. A century earlier, a reformer named Shang Yang had abolished hereditary aristocracy and replaced it with brutal meritocracy based on military achievement. He had organized the population into groups collectively responsible for each other's behavior. He had imposed punishments so severe that crime became unthinkable. The result was a state that functioned like a machine built for war, and its harshness had become its strength. Ying Zheng recognized this world. It operated according to principles his childhood had taught him. That sentiment was weakness, that only results mattered, that survival belonged to those willing to do whatever was required. His father's reign lasted only 3 years. In 247 BC, King Zhuangxiang died, and 13-year-old Ying Zheng inherited the throne of Qin. He was a boy king, surrounded by ministers who saw no reason to defer to a child. Lu Buwei, whose schemes had made all of this possible, assumed the role of regent, governing the kingdom while its nominal ruler came of age. The young king watched and waited. He had learned patience in the cellars of Handan, where survival depended on stillness. Now he applied those lessons to the Qin court, observing who held real power, who could be trusted, who would need to be destroyed. The boy who had been abandoned in enemy territory was becoming something far more dangerous than his enemies suspected. A ruler who trusted no one, feared nothing, and intended to remake the world. The throne of Qin was merely the beginning. Beyond the kingdom's borders lay 6 rival states that had divided China for centuries. Ying Zheng looked upon that fragmented map and saw not obstacles, but opportunities. The child of hostages and merchants, of survival and suspicion, had inherited the most powerful military machine of his age. He intended to use it. The boy sat on the throne, but other hands held the power. Lu Buwei governed Qin with the confidence of a man collecting on his investment, his title of prime minister granting him authority that the 13-year-old king could not yet challenge. The merchant who had gambled on a hostage prince now commanded armies, dispensed justice, and conducted diplomacy with neighboring states. He even compiled an encyclopedia, the Lushi Chungqiu, gathering scholars to produce a work that would cement his reputation as a man of culture and wisdom. Yingzheng observed it all from his gilded cage, learning which courtiers truly served the throne and which served only themselves. But Lu Buwei's grip on power concealed a secret that would have destroyed him if exposed. His relationship with the Queen Dowager, Yingzheng's mother, Lady Zhao, had not ended when she married Prince Zichu. The former lovers continued their affair within the palace walls, their meetings arranged through networks of servants whose silence was purchased with gold and threats. As the young king grew older and more observant, Lu Buwei recognized the danger. Discovery would mean execution for adultery with a royal consort. He needed to extract himself without losing Lady Zhao's political support. His solution was to find a replacement. Lao Ai was a man of reportedly extraordinary physical endowments, a fact that Lu Buwei exploited with the cold calculation that had made him wealthy. The merchant arranged for Lao Ai to be presented to the Queen Dowager as entertainment, and the demonstration achieved its intended effect. Lady Zhao wanted him, but palace protocol forbade men other than eunuchs from residing in the queen's quarters, so Lu Buwei arranged a false castration. Lao Ai's eyebrows and beard were plucked to complete the disguise, and he entered the Queen Dowager's household as a servant. The deception held for years. Lady Zhao bore Lao Ai 2 sons in secret, children whose existence represented treason of the highest order. The false eunuch accumulated power with the Queen Dowager's backing, receiving titles, lands, and a household staff that numbered in the thousands. He began to imagine himself as something more than a consort's plaything, perhaps a regent, perhaps even the power behind a new king, if anything should happen to Yingzheng. The young king was 21 years old when the conspiracy unraveled. In 238 BC, as Yingzheng traveled to the ancient capital of Huang for his capping ceremony, the ritual that would mark his official assumption of adult authority, word reached him that Lao Ai had raised an army and was marching on the palace. The false eunuch had stolen the Queen Dowager's seal and used it to mobilize troops, gambling everything on a coup that would place one of his own sons on the throne. The gamble failed catastrophically. Yingzheng's forces crushed the rebellion before it could gain momentum, and Lao Ai fled with the remnants of his supporters. The capture that followed revealed the full scope of the conspiracy. The secret children, the forged documents, the network of officials who had enabled years of deception. The young king's response demonstrated the character that his childhood had forged. Lao Ai died by the punishment reserved for traitors. His limbs were torn from his body by horses driven in opposite directions, his screams echoing across the execution ground as a warning to anyone who might contemplate similar treachery. His entire clan was exterminated to the 3rd degree of relation. The 2 infant sons he had fathered with the Queen Dowager, Yingzheng's own half-brothers, were stuffed into sacks and beaten to death. The young king showed no mercy, because mercy, in his understanding, was an invitation to further betrayal. His mother presented a more complex problem. Executing the Queen Dowager would violate every principle of filial piety, bringing condemnation from across the realm. Instead, Yingzheng exiled her to a remote palace, forbidding her from returning to court. When ministers protested this treatment of his mother, he had 27 of them executed before a brave official named Mao Jiao convinced him that such severity was damaging his reputation. Lady Zhao was eventually permitted to return, but the relationship between mother and son had been severed beyond repair. Lu Buwei's involvement in the Lao Ai affair could not be overlooked. The merchant had introduced the false eunuch to the Queen Dowager, had arranged the fraudulent castration, had enabled years of deception that culminated in armed rebellion. Yet the man who had placed Yingzheng's father on the throne who might even be Yingzheng's biological father, could not simply be executed without raising uncomfortable questions. The king stripped Lu Buwei of his titles and banished him to distant Shu. The former prime minister might have lived out his days in comfortable exile, but he could not resist maintaining correspondence with officials and foreign rulers, demonstrating that his influence had not entirely disappeared. When Yingzheng learned of these continued political activities, he sent a letter that made the king's displeasure clear. "What have you done for Qin? Yet you are called the Marquis of Wengshin, with a fief of 100,000 households. What relation are you to the king? Yet you are called a presumptive father." The message was unmistakable. Lu Buwei drank poison and died, taking to his grave whatever secrets he held about the true parentage of the king of Qin. At 22 years old, Yingzheng finally ruled without rivals or regents. The purges that followed the Laowai conspiracy had cleared the court of those whose primary loyalty had been to the Queen Dowager or the former Prime Minister. In their place, the young king elevated men chosen for their abilities rather than their connections, a meritocratic approach that echoed the legalist principles on which Qin had been built. Li Si arrived at court as a scholar from the state of Chu, his brilliant mind matched by ambition that burned like fire. He had studied under Xunzi, one of the great Confucian philosophers, but his own philosophy had evolved toward the harsher doctrines of legalism. In a memorial to the king, Li Si argued that Qin stood at a unique moment in history. "This is the one moment in 10,000 ages. If your highness allows it to slip away, the feudal lords will recover their strength and unite against Qin." The young king recognized in Li Si a mind that matched his own in scope and ruthlessness. The scholar rose rapidly through the administration. Wei Lo, a military strategist, proved more difficult to recruit. After his first audience with Yingzheng, he reportedly told associates that the king of Qin had the nose of a wasp, eyes of a hawk, chest of a bird of prey, and voice of a jackal. Such a man, Wei Liao warned, would devour men once he had achieved his aims. The strategist attempted to flee the kingdom, but was persuaded to remain. His insights into warfare would prove invaluable in the campaigns to come. The machinery of conquest began to turn. Qin armies probed the defenses of neighboring states, while Qin diplomats worked to prevent the formation of alliances that might resist expansion. Gold and promises corrupted officials in rival courts, creating networks of informants who reported on military preparations and political weaknesses. Yingzheng was not content merely to rule Qin. He intended to rule everything. Not everyone accepted this ambition quietly. In 227 BC, a man named Jing Ke walked into the throne room of the Qin palace, carrying a map of conquered territory and a poisoned dagger hidden within its rolled silk. The assassination attempt had been sponsored by Prince Dan of Yan, a state that lay directly in the path of Qin expansion. Jing Ke was not a professional killer, but a wandering swordsman who had been recruited through appeals to his honor and promises of immortal fame. He carried with him, as proof of his bona fides, the severed head of a Qin general who had defected to Yan. This grisly trophy purchased his audience with the king. Protocol demanded that visitors approach the throne unarmed, so the dagger had been concealed in the map case. Jing Ke mounted the steps toward where Yingzheng sat, unrolling the map as he approached. When the silk revealed the blade hidden within, he seized the king by the sleeve and thrust at his chest. The fabric tore. Yingzheng stumbled backward, escaping the first strike by inches. What followed was chaos. The king circling a pillar to evade his attacker, his sword so long that he could not draw it from its scabbard while running. his guards frozen in place because protocol forbade armed men from entering the throne room without explicit command. A court physician named Xia Wuju threw his medicine bag at Jing Kai, buying the king precious seconds to finally draw his weapon. Ying Zheng's first stroke severed Jing Kai's thigh. The assassin collapsed, hurling his poisoned dagger in a final desperate attempt, but it struck a pillar harmlessly. As the king's guards finally rushed forward to finish him, Jing Kai reportedly laughed. "I failed because I wanted to capture you alive and force you to return the territories you've stolen." The assassination attempt transformed Ying Zheng. Whatever capacity for trust had survived his childhood now disappeared entirely. He tripled his personal guard. He slept in a different palace each night, his location known only to his most trusted servants. He accelerated plans to destroy Yan and every other state that might harbor enemies. The young king had survived betrayal by his mother's lover, manipulation by his possible father, and now a blade aimed at his heart. Each trauma had stripped away another layer of human vulnerability, leaving behind something harder and colder. A ruler who saw threats everywhere, because threats existed everywhere, who trusted no one because those closest to him had proven most dangerous. He was 22 years old when he assumed full power. He was 33 when Jing Kai's dagger missed his heart. In the years between and the years that followed, he would prove that the strategist Wei Liao had been right about one thing. This king of Qin would indeed devour men. He would devour armies, kingdoms, and entire ways of life. The unification of China was about to begin. The 6 kingdoms that had divided China for centuries fell like dominoes pushed by a single relentless hand. Between 230 and 221 BC, Qin armies swept across the landscape in campaigns that combined military genius with diplomatic treachery, systematic planning with overwhelming force. When the dust settled, a world that had known only war suddenly discovered what peace under a single ruler looked like. Many would conclude it looked like terror. Ying Zheng approached conquest with the same cold calculation that Lu Buwei had once applied to commerce. Each rival state was analyzed for weaknesses: corrupt officials who could be bribed, generals who could be turned, internal divisions that could be exploited. Gold preceded armies, purchasing betrayals that made battles easier to win. The king spent fortunes on espionage networks that mapped enemy defenses and reported on political intrigues. By the time Qin soldiers marched, they often knew more about their targets than the defenders knew about themselves. Han fell first in 230 BC, the smallest and weakest of the rival states. Its territory had been squeezed for generations between more powerful neighbors, its resources depleted by decades of defensive warfare. When Qin armies crossed the border, Han's king surrendered rather than watch his people slaughtered in a hopeless cause. The conquest established a template: swift advance, overwhelming force, terms that preserved lives in exchange for absolute submission. Those who resisted were annihilated. Those who submitted were absorbed. Zhao was next, and this conquest carried personal weight that mere strategy could not explain. Ying Zheng had been born in Zhao's capital, had spent his childhood hiding from citizens who wanted him dead, had absorbed hatred for this kingdom with his mother's milk. When his armies marched on Handan in 228 BC, they carried orders that went beyond military necessity. The city that had once threatened to execute a hostage child would learn what that child had become. The siege of Handan was methodical and merciless. Qin engineers diverted rivers to flood defensive positions, while catapults hurled stones that shattered walls which had stood for centuries. When the city finally fell, Yingzheng reportedly traveled to witness the aftermath personally. He sought out every person who had wronged his mother's family during those desperate years of hiding, and he had them buried alive. The mass executions served no strategic purpose. Zhao had already surrendered, but strategy was not the point. This was revenge, served cold after 2 decades of waiting. Wei fell in 225 BC through a combination of military brilliance and engineering audacity. The kingdom's capital, Daliang, was protected by walls that had resisted sieges for generations, and a garrison prepared to fight to the death. Rather than waste his soldiers against such defenses, the Qin commander Wang Ben ordered his engineers to dam the Yellow River and redirect its waters toward the city. For 3 months, the river rose around Daliang's walls, seeping through foundations, flooding streets, drowning the defenders' hope along with their homes. When the walls finally collapsed under the water's weight, Qin's soldiers waded through the ruins to accept a surrender that the floods had made inevitable. Chu presented the greatest challenge, a vast southern kingdom with resources and population that dwarfed the other remaining states. Its territory stretched from the Yangtze River to the borders of the southern barbarians. Its armies numbered in the hundreds of thousands, and its people possessed a fierce independence that would not yield easily to northern conquest. The campaign against Chu would test Qin's military machine as nothing before had done. Yingzheng summoned his generals to debate strategy. A young commander named Li Xin, fresh from victories against smaller opponents, declared that 200,000 troops would be sufficient to crush Chu. The veteran general Wang Jian disagreed. He had spent his career studying warfare, and he understood that Chu's size transformed the calculus of conquest entirely. 600,000, Wang Jian insisted. Nothing less will suffice. The king chose youth over experience. Li Xin received his 200,000 soldiers and marched south with the confidence of a man who had never known defeat. That confidence lasted until Chu's forces caught his army overextended, cut his supply lines, and inflicted a catastrophe that killed 7 senior commanders and sent the survivors fleeing north in disorder. The greatest military setback of Yingzheng's reign had been caused by his own impatience. Humiliation required the king to seek out Wang Jian, who had retired to his estates after being passed over for the Chu command. The old general made Yingzheng wait, then made him ask repeatedly, then demanded guarantees of rewards and properties before agreeing to serve. This was not mere greed. Wang Jian understood that a king who had just suffered a major defeat might look for scapegoats, and a general who commanded 600,000 soldiers might seem dangerously powerful. By appearing motivated by wealth rather than ambition, Wang Jian protected himself from suspicion. The second Chu campaign unfolded with the patience that the first had lacked. Wang Jian advanced methodically, building fortifications, securing supply lines, refusing battle until conditions favored his forces absolutely. When Chu's generals grew frustrated and attacked his defensive positions, he let them break themselves against prepared defenses. When they retreated to regroup, he followed at a pace that prevented them from recovering, while never exposing his own forces to counterattack. The campaign lasted over a year, a grinding war of attrition that Qin's superior resources made inevitable. In 223 BC, Chu's king was captured and his kingdom annexed, its vast territories adding enormously to Qin's already formidable domain. Yan had been wounded by the Jingke affair, its sponsorship of the assassination attempt giving Yingzheng all the justification he needed for vengeance. Prince Dan, who had recruited the assassin, fled north as Qin armies crossed the border. His own father, the king of Yan, had Dan executed and sent his head to Qin in a desperate attempt to purchase peace. The gesture failed. Yingzheng wanted the kingdom, not just the prince who had tried to kill him. By 222 BC, Yan had ceased to exist as an independent state, its royal family scattered or dead, its territories absorbed into the growing Qin Empire. Qi remained, the last of the 7 kingdoms, wealthy from trade and protected by distance from the Western conquests. Its king had watched his neighbors fall one by one, had accepted Qin bribes to remain neutral while other states were destroyed, had calculated that accommodation would preserve what resistance could not. He calculated wrong. In 221 BC, Qin armies that no longer faced any other opponents turned east. Qi's king, who had never prepared for war because he believed diplomacy would save him, surrendered without significant resistance. The last obstacle to unification simply stepped aside. In the autumn of 221 BC, Yingzheng surveyed a realm that stretched from the northern steppes to the southern jungles, from the eastern seas to the western mountains. For the first time in Chinese history, a single ruler controlled all the lands that considered themselves civilized. The Warring States period, which had consumed millions of lives across 2.5 centuries, was over. Something new was beginning. The king who had achieved this unprecedented conquest decided that he required an unprecedented title. The old designations, king, duke, lord, had been worn by men who ruled fragments of the civilized world. He had conquered the whole of it. His ministers proposed combining 2 ancient titles reserved for legendary sage rulers: Huang, used for the mythical Yellow Emperor, and Dai, used for the divine rulers who had preceded recorded history. Together, they formed Huangdi, a title that could be translated as emperor, but carried connotations of divinity that no previous ruler had claimed. To this, Yingzheng added Shi, meaning first, and Qin for his dynasty. He became Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor of Qin. The title announced his intentions. This was not merely a reign, but the beginning of a dynasty that would last, in his words, for 10,000 generations. His successors would be numbered second emperor, third emperor, and so on until the end of time itself. History, he believed, had reached its culmination in him. The first emperor was 38 years old. He had spent his entire adult life planning and executing the conquest of China. Now he faced a challenge that would prove even more difficult than military victory: transforming 6 conquered kingdoms with different cultures, different customs, and different resentments into a single unified state. The wars of conquest were over. The work of empire was just beginning. The first emperor understood that conquering 6 kingdoms was easier than governing them. Millions of people who had spent their lives as citizens of Zhao or Chu or Qi did not suddenly become loyal subjects of Qin because their rulers had surrendered. They spoke different dialects, used different writing systems, measured goods with different weights, and harbored resentments that military defeat had intensified rather than erased. Qin Shi Huang looked upon this fractured inheritance and saw a problem that required a radical solution. He would erase the differences entirely. His ministers debated how the new empire should be structured. Many advocated the traditional feudal system, parceling out territories to the emperor's sons and meritorious generals, who would rule as semi-independent lords, owing allegiance to the throne. This approach had worked for centuries under the Zhou dynasty. It distributed the burden of governance while creating a network of loyal subordinates invested in the regime's survival. Li Si argued against tradition with a logic that appealed to the emperor's deepest instincts. Feudalism, he warned, planted the seeds of future division. Lords who ruled their own territories would eventually see themselves as independent powers. Their sons and grandsons, lacking the personal bonds that had tied the original grantees to the throne, would drift toward autonomy. Within a few generations, China would fracture again into warring states, and everything the first emperor had achieved would be undone. The emperor chose centralization. He divided China into 36 commanderies, later expanded to 48, each governed by officials appointed by and answerable to the throne. These administrators served at the emperor's pleasure, could be transferred or dismissed at will, and possessed no hereditary claims to their positions. Power flowed downward from Xianyang, and loyalty flowed upward in return. No regional lord would accumulate enough authority to challenge imperial control. To ensure this system's permanence, Huang attacked the foundations of regional identity itself. He ordered the standardization of Chinese writing, replacing the variant scripts that had developed in different kingdoms with a single unified system. Officials who had grown up writing Chu characters now learned Qin forms or lost their positions. The practical benefits were obvious. Documents from any part of the empire could be read in any other part. But the cultural implications ran deeper. A people who wrote the same way would eventually think the same way. Weights and measures followed. A shi of grain in the former Qi territories would now equal exactly a shi in former Chu lands. Merchants could no longer exploit regional variations to cheat customers or evade taxes. More importantly, imperial tax collectors could now calculate revenues with precision across the entire realm. Standardization served efficiency, but efficiency served control. Even the axles of carts were regulated to a uniform width, ensuring that wheels throughout the empire would fit the same ruts in the same roads. This seemingly minor decree reflected a vision of total administrative reach. The emperor's authority extended to the spacing of wooden wheels on peasant carts, and no detail was too small for imperial attention. Currency underwent similar transformation. The diverse coins of the conquered kingdoms, with their different shapes and values, gave way to standardized Qin money, round copper coins with square holes in the center. The shape carried symbolic weight. Heaven was round, earth was square, and the coin that combined both represented the cosmic order that the emperor claimed to embody. But symbolism aside, unified currency meant unified economy, and unified economy meant unified control. The former aristocrats of the conquered states presented a particular danger. These noble families possessed wealth, local influence, and memories of independence that made them natural focal points for resistance. Huang's solution was brutally elegant. He ordered 120,000 of the wealthiest families forcibly relocated to Xianyang, the imperial capital. Stripped from their home territories and transplanted to a city where the emperor's power was absolute, they could be watched, controlled, and prevented from fomenting rebellion. Their estates in the provinces were confiscated and redistributed, eliminating the economic foundations of potential resistance. Weapons posed another threat. The armies of the conquered kingdoms had been disarmed, but countless swords and spears remained in private hands throughout the empire. The emperor ordered all weapons collected from the former states brought to Xianyang and melted down. From the bronze, his craftsmen cast 12 enormous statues, each reportedly weighing over 30 tons, which stood in the palace complex as monuments to the permanent peace that disarmament would ensure. The statues proclaimed that the age of warfare had ended, and that the emperor alone now possessed the means of violence. Roads spread across the empire like blood vessels through a body, carrying imperial commands to every corner of the realm, and returning with taxes, troops, and intelligence. The most impressive was the Jidao, the Straight Road, a military highway that stretched over 700 kilometers from Xianyang to the northern frontier. Built wide enough for cavalry charges and graded smooth enough for rapid chariot movement, it allowed the emperor to project force against nomadic raiders with unprecedented speed. What once would have required months of march could now be accomplished in weeks. The Lingku Canal connected river systems in the south, enabling the transport of grain and soldiers through territories that geography had previously isolated. Engineers overcame elevation changes with lock systems that allowed boats to climb hills through successive chambers of rising water. The canal made permanent the conquest of the far south, transforming military occupation into administrative integration. At the northern frontier, the first emperor confronted the Xiongnu, nomadic warriors whose ancestors had raided Chinese settlements since before recorded history. General Meng Tian led 300,000 troops into the steppes, pushing the nomads north of the Yellow River and establishing a defensive line across hundreds of miles of territory. To hold these gains, the emperor ordered existing walls from the former northern states connected and extended into a continuous fortification. The structure that emerged would eventually be known as the Great Wall of China, though its Qin dynasty incarnation bore little resemblance to the stone monument that tourists visit today. Qinshi Huang's wall was built primarily of rammed earth, layers of soil packed between wooden frames, until they hardened into barriers that could resist cavalry charges. The labor required was staggering. Hundreds of thousands of conscripts, convicts, and soldiers worked in conditions so brutal that their bodies were sometimes simply incorporated into the wall itself when they died. The fortification stretched across mountains and deserts, a scar across the landscape that proclaimed the boundary between civilization and barbarism. Xianyang grew into a capital worthy of the empire it governed. The first emperor constructed palaces on a scale that contemporaries found difficult to comprehend, their halls vast enough to seat thousands, their treasures gathered from every conquered kingdom. Each time he destroyed a rival state, he ordered replicas of its royal palace built near his own capital, creating a collection of architectural trophies that demonstrated the scope of his victories. Craftsmen and artisans from across China were conscripted to populate workshops that produced luxury goods for imperial consumption. The Epang Palace, which Qinshi Huang began but never completed, was planned as the supreme monument to his reign. According to historical accounts, its front hall alone would have measured over 600 meters in length, capable of seating 10,000 people. Walkways would connect it to other structures across the Wei River, creating a palace complex that sprawled across miles of territory. The project consumed resources and labor on a scale that strained even the empire's vast capacities, and it remained unfinished at the emperor's death. 5 times during his reign, the first emperor traveled across his realm on inspection tours that combined political ceremony with personal obsession. He climbed sacred mountains where ancient rulers had performed rituals connecting heaven and earth. He visited the eastern coast, where the ocean stretched toward islands that legends claimed held the secret of immortality. At each significant location, he ordered stone inscriptions erected proclaiming his achievements, the unification of the realm, the standardization of laws, the establishment of eternal peace. These steles were propaganda carved in granite, intended to shape how future generations would remember his reign. The personality that emerged from these years of absolute power confirmed the warnings that Wei Liao had delivered decades earlier. Qinshi Huang grew increasingly isolated, suspicious, and obsessive. He worked through mountains of documents daily, personally reviewing reports from across the empire with an attention to detail that exhausted his ministers. He trusted no one fully, maintained networks of informants who watched his own officials, and responded to any hint of disloyalty with punishments so severe they were meant to deter through terror alone. The empire he built was extraordinary, an administrative achievement unprecedented in human history, a demonstration of what centralized power could accomplish when wielded without restraint. Roads, canals, walls, and standardized systems transformed a patchwork of warring kingdoms into something approaching a unified state. But the methods that created this unity also sowed the seeds of future disaster. An empire built on fear required a fearsome ruler to maintain it. And the first emperor was beginning to realize that even absolute power could not protect him from the one enemy he could never defeat. Death stalked the first emperor's thoughts with increasing persistence as the years of his reign accumulated. He had survived assassination attempts, conquered kingdoms, built monuments that would endure for millennia. Yet none of it could delay the inevitable moment when his body would fail and his empire would pass to other hands. This fear, perhaps more than any administrative necessity, drove the policies that would make his name synonymous with tyranny for the next 2,000 years. The trouble began, as so many troubles do, with men who thought too much and spoke too freely. At a banquet in 213 BC, a Confucian scholar named Chunyu Yue rose to offer the emperor advice. The ancient ways, he argued, had proven their worth across centuries of practice. The Zhou dynasty had endured for 800 years by granting fiefs to royal kinsmen, creating a network of loyal supporters who stabilized the realm. By contrast, the first emperor's centralized system concentrated all power in hands that would eventually grow cold and still. I have never heard of anything lasting long that was not based on ancient precedent, Chunyu Yue declared. Those who do not learn from the past will not survive in the present. The words struck at the foundations of everything the emperor had built. His entire system rejected the past as a guide to governance, rejected feudalism, rejected the accumulated wisdom of the Zhou dynasty, rejected the very premise that history offered lessons worth learning. If scholars could openly advocate returning to abandoned traditions, how long before that advocacy became conspiracy? How long before nostalgia for the old kingdoms became plots to restore them? Li Si recognized the danger and proposed a solution so extreme that it would echo through Chinese history forever. The problem, he argued, was not this one scholar, but the entire class of educated men who used their learning to criticize the present by praising the past. They quoted ancient texts to undermine imperial policies. They gathered students and spread ideas that questioned the emperor's wisdom. They represented an alternative source of authority that existed independent of state control. And in Qinshi Huang's empire, no independent authority could be tolerated. In the past, the empire was divided and in chaos, and no one was able to unify it. Li Si's memorial to the emperor read. All the various scholars praise their own schools of thought and criticize what the state has established. Now your majesty has unified the empire, but these scholars of private learning gather together to slander the laws and teachings. His proposal was comprehensive. All historical records, except those of Qin, should be burned. The book of songs, the book of documents, and the writings of the 100 schools of philosophy should be destroyed. Only texts on practical subjects, medicine, agriculture, divination, would be preserved. Private collections would be confiscated and consigned to flames. Anyone who discussed forbidden books would be executed. Anyone who used the past to criticize the present would be put to death, along with their entire family. Scholars who wished to study law could learn from government officials. No other form of education would be permitted. The first emperor approved. Throughout the empire, bonfires consumed the accumulated wisdom of centuries. Bamboo strips and silk scrolls that had preserved the thoughts of Confucius and Mencius. The histories of fallen kingdoms, the poetry that had sustained Chinese culture through generations of warfare, all fed the flames of a policy designed to make the past unrememberable. Officials supervised the burnings to ensure compliance. Families who had treasured books for generations faced a choice between surrendering their libraries and risking execution if their defiance was discovered. Not everything burned. The imperial library retained copies of forbidden texts, preserved for the emperor's own reference, even as his subjects were denied access. Scholars who served the state could still consult ancient works in the course of their official duties. And throughout China, individuals took risks that could cost them their lives, hiding books in walls, burying them in gardens, memorizing passages that might otherwise be lost forever. The burning of books destroyed much, but it did not destroy everything, a fact that would become apparent only after the dynasty that ordered the destruction had itself been consigned to history. The following year brought a second atrocity, distinct from the book burning, but forever linked to it in historical memory. The first emperor had become increasingly reliant on alchemists and magicians who promised what his administrators could not deliver: escape from death itself. He had spent fortunes on their potions and rituals, had sent expeditions to search for immortality, had allowed these charlatans access to his court because they offered the one thing his power could not otherwise obtain. When two of his most trusted alchemists, Huang and Sheng, fled the capital after privately mocking the emperor's credulity and criticizing his character, Qin Shi Huang's rage found a broader target. Investigation revealed that scholars throughout Xianyang had been spreading similar criticisms, questioning imperial policies, and disseminating precisely the kind of independent thought that the book burning had been designed to eliminate. The emperor ordered a purge. Officials compiled lists of scholars suspected of violating the prohibitions against private learning and seditious speech. Interrogations produced confessions that implicated colleagues, students, and friends. The investigations fed on themselves, each arrest generating new accusations, each torture session producing new names. When the purge finally ended, more than 460 scholars had been condemned. They were buried alive. The mass execution took place outside Xianyang, where pits had been dug to receive the condemned. Scholars who had devoted their lives to learning, men who could recite classics from memory, who had trained students in the philosophies of the ancients, who represented the intellectual traditions of the conquered kingdoms, were thrown into the earth and covered while they still breathed. The emperor intended the punishment to silence criticism forever. In this, as in so much else, he underestimated how memory could outlast terror. Crown Prince Fusu watched these events with horror that he could not entirely conceal. The emperor's eldest son had received a traditional education before his father's prohibition on private learning, and he retained sympathies for Confucian principles that his father had rejected. When the burial of scholars was announced, Fusu made the mistake of voicing his objections openly. The empire has just been pacified, he argued to his father. The people in the distant regions have not yet been won over. The scholars all study and imitate Confucius. If your majesty punishes them so severely, I fear the empire will become unstable. The first emperor's response demonstrated how thoroughly paranoia had consumed him. His own son, the heir to his throne, had spoken words that echoed the criticisms of the condemned scholars. Rather than see this as the loyal counsel of a concerned successor, Qin Shi Huang saw betrayal. He exiled Fusu to the northern frontier, ostensibly to assist General Meng Tian in defending against the Xiongnu, but actually to remove from court a voice that had dared to question imperial judgment. The exile served multiple purposes. It separated Fusu from potential supporters in the capital. It tested his loyalty by assigning him to harsh conditions far from the comforts of the palace. And it sent a message to every official in the empire. If the emperor's own son could be punished for speaking unwelcome truths, no one was safe. In the years that followed, the first emperor retreated ever deeper into isolation and suspicion. He moved between palaces unpredictably, never sleeping in the same location twice, his whereabouts known only to his most trusted servants. The penalty for revealing his location was death. Officials who wished to present reports did so in writing, their memorials reviewed by intermediaries before reaching the imperial presence. The emperor who had conquered China now feared to walk freely in his own capital. The apparatus of control that had unified an empire now turned inward, monitoring the population for any sign of dissent, any whisper of criticism, any hint that the past the emperor had tried to erase still lived in memory. Informants reported on neighbors. Officials denounced rivals. The legal system that Yang had designed to create order through predictable punishment became an instrument of arbitrary terror. Its severity applied not according to fixed rules, but according to the emperor's shifting suspicions. What Qin Shi Huang had built was extraordinary, but it was also fragile in ways he refused to acknowledge. An empire held together by fear required constant vigilance to maintain. A succession that depended on a single man's will could be disrupted by anyone who controlled access to that man in his final moments. A system that had silenced every independent voice had also eliminated every honest counselor who might have warned of dangers ahead. The first emperor had perhaps a decade of reign remaining when the scholars' bodies vanished beneath Xianyang's soil. He would spend those years increasingly consumed by a quest that even his vast power could not fulfill. The search for a way to reign forever, to defeat the one enemy that no army could conquer and no wall could hold back. He began to seek immortality with the desperation of a man who finally understood that death was coming for him and that everything he had built might not survive his passing. The first emperor had conquered every enemy that flesh and blood could present. He had unified a realm that wise men said could never be unified. He had imposed his will on millions of people across thousands of miles of territory. But in the quiet hours of the night, when even emperors must confront the truth of their own mortality, Qin Shi Huang understood that none of it would matter if he could not find a way to live forever. The quest consumed him. Ancient Chinese tradition spoke of immortals who had transcended the limitations of human existence, sages who had discovered elixirs that granted eternal life, who dwelt on mystical islands beyond the eastern sea, where death held no dominion. These legends had circulated for centuries as pleasant fantasies, stories told to comfort the dying and entertain the living. Qin Shi Huang decided to treat them as actionable intelligence. Alchemists and magicians flooded into the imperial court, drawn by the promise of unlimited resources for any man who could deliver what the emperor sought. They brought recipes for potions that combined mercury, sulfur, and exotic herbs. They brought meditation techniques supposedly practiced by the immortals themselves. They brought maps to sacred mountains where the secrets of eternal life might be discovered. The emperor tried everything, swallowing concoctions that probably shortened his life even as they promised to extend it, funding expeditions to locations that existed only in mythology. Shufu was the most audacious of these seekers. A court magician, with the confidence of a man who had nothing to lose, he convinced the first emperor that the islands of the immortals, Penglai, Fangjiang, and Yingzhou, lay just beyond the horizon of the Eastern Sea. The immortals who dwelt there possessed the elixir of life, but they would not surrender it to ordinary men. A proper expedition would require ships, supplies, and offerings worthy of divine beings. In 219 BC, Shufu sailed east with a fleet carrying thousands of young men and women, some accounts say 3,000 of each, along with craftsmen, farmers, and supplies sufficient to establish a colony. The emperor had spared no expense. These were not merely sailors on a voyage of exploration. They were potential tribute to the immortals, gifts that might persuade the deathless ones to share their secrets. Shufu never returned. Years passed with no word from the expedition. The emperor sent inquiries, dispatched search parties, demanded explanations. Eventually, Shufu reappeared at court with empty hands and an elaborate excuse. He had found the islands, he claimed, but a great sea creature had blocked his approach. He needed archers, he said, to kill the beast before he could complete his mission. The emperor, desperate enough to believe, provided the archers and authorized a second expedition. This fleet also vanished beyond the eastern horizon. Legend holds that Shufu reached Japan and established a settlement there, choosing to live as a king among mortals, rather than return to face an emperor whose patience was exhaustible. Whether this tradition contains any truth, the historical record confirms only that the expeditions consumed enormous resources and delivered nothing. The elixir of eternal life remained as distant as ever. While alchemists promised immortality, assassins continued to promise death. Gao Jianli had been a friend of Jing Ke, the man who had nearly killed the emperor with a poisoned dagger years earlier. He was also a master of the zhu, a stringed instrument that he played with sufficient skill to earn fame throughout the former kingdoms. After the failed assassination, Gao Jianli had gone into hiding, changing his name and working as a servant. But his musical talent eventually drew attention, and word of his abilities reached the imperial court. The first emperor loved music, and he summoned the mysterious musician for a performance. When Gao Jianli's true identity was revealed, a wiser ruler might have ordered immediate execution. Instead, Qin Shi Huang, perhaps moved by the man's artistry, perhaps confident in his own security, chose to blind him and keep him at court as a performer. The assassin's friend would entertain the man who had killed his companion. It was a decision the emperor would regret. Gao Jianli filled his instrument with lead, transforming it from a tool of beauty into a weapon. During a performance, he swung the weighted zhu at the emperor's head, attempting to accomplish through blunt force what Jing Ke had failed to achieve with a blade. He missed. The guards did not. Gao Jianli died for his attempt, and the first emperor never again allowed anyone from the former states to approach his person. Zhang Liang's attempt came from a different direction entirely. A young nobleman from the conquered state of Han, Zhang Liang had devoted his family's fortune to revenge. He hired a strongman of legendary power and commissioned an iron cone weighing 120 pounds. In 218 BC, as the emperor's procession passed through Bolangsha, the strongman hurled his weapon at the imperial carriage with enough force to shatter it completely. He hit the wrong carriage. The first emperor, ever paranoid, had taken to traveling with multiple identical vehicles, switching between them unpredictably. The decoy that the iron cone destroyed contained only guards, while the real emperor watched from safety. Zhang Liang escaped the subsequent manhunt and would eventually become one of the architects of the dynasty that replaced the Qin. But in 218 BC, he was simply another failed assassin, one more data point in the emperor's growing certainty that the world wanted him dead. These attempts reinforced what the search for immortality had already made clear. Time was running out. If the emperor could not escape death, he could at least prepare for it on his own terms. The tomb he had been constructing since his first year on the throne became an obsession that rivaled his quest for eternal life. The mausoleum at Mount Li was designed to be an underground empire, a realm where Qin Shi Huang would reign forever even if his body could not survive. 700,000 laborers worked on its construction over the course of decades, carving chambers from the earth, filling them with treasures gathered from across the realm, creating a mirror of the world above for the emperor's use in the world below. The main burial chamber, according to accounts written shortly after the dynasty's fall, contained a model of the empire itself. Rivers and seas of liquid mercury flowed through channels carved to match the geography of China, their toxic waters circulating through mechanical means that kept them moving perpetually. The ceiling displayed the constellations of heaven, while the floor mapped the territories of earth. Crossbow traps guarded the approaches, designed to kill any intruder who penetrated the outer defenses. When construction was complete, the craftsmen who knew its secrets would be sealed inside to ensure that those secrets died with them. Surrounding the central tomb, an army stood, eternal guard. Thousands of life-size terracotta warriors, each with individually crafted features, were arranged in battle formation to protect the emperor in death, as his living soldiers had protected him in life. Infantry, cavalry, archers, and officers assumed positions they would hold for millennia, their clay faces frozen in expressions of vigilant readiness. Chariots of bronze carried ceramic drivers toward destinations they would never reach. The army that had conquered 6 kingdoms was recreated in fired clay to conquer whatever enemies awaited in the afterlife. The first emperor toured his realm for the 5th and final time in 210 BC, traveling east toward the sea where Shufu had disappeared a decade earlier. Perhaps he hoped that the alchemist had finally succeeded and was returning with the elixir. Perhaps he simply wanted to gaze upon the ocean that had swallowed so many of his hopes. Perhaps he was running from the death he could feel approaching. At a place called Shakyu, far from his capital, far from his tomb, far from everyone who might have offered comfort, the first emperor's body finally betrayed him. The historical record does not specify the cause of death. Perhaps the mercury-laced elixirs he had consumed for years. Perhaps illness contracted during the journey. Perhaps simply the accumulated strain of decades of paranoid vigilance. He was 49 years old. He had reigned as king of Qin for 25 years and as first emperor for 11. His death occurred in the 7th month of 210 BC, during the heat of summer. The men who attended him in his final moments faced an immediate crisis. The emperor had died far from the capital, without clearly designating his successor, and announcing his death might trigger the very chaos that his entire reign had been designed to prevent. They chose concealment. The emperor's body was placed in his enclosed carriage, and the procession continued as if nothing had happened. Officials delivered reports to the carriage door and received responses that they believed came from within. Meals were brought to the imperial vehicle at regular intervals. The emperor, they were assured, was simply feeling unwell and did not wish to be disturbed. Summer heat accelerated the decay that the conspirators were desperate to hide. The smell of death began to emanate from the imperial carriage, impossible to explain away as mere illness. The solution was as practical as it was grotesque. Carts of salted fish were positioned around the emperor's vehicle, their pungent odor masking the stench of decomposition. The procession crawled towards Xianyang, surrounded by rotting fish, carrying at its center the rotting body of the man who had united China. The first emperor had sought to live forever. Instead, he returned to his capital as cargo, his death hidden behind the reek of fish, his legacy about to be consumed by the conspiracies of the very servants he had trusted to attend his final moments. 3 men rode beside the imperial carriage as it crawled toward Xianyang, and between them they would destroy everything the first emperor had built. Zhao Gao was a eunuch who had risen to become the emperor's most trusted attendant, a man whose proximity to power had cultivated ambitions that his lowly origins should have made impossible. Li Si was the prime minister whose brilliance had shaped the empire's laws, and whose complicity would now be purchased through fear. Hu Hai was the emperor's youngest son, a weak and pliable youth, whose only qualification for the throne was his willingness to be controlled. The legitimate heir was far away. Crown Prince Fu Su remained at the northern frontier with General Meng Tian, exiled for the crime of offering honest counsel. The first emperor had prepared a letter before his death, summoning Fu Su back to the capital to preside over the funeral and assume the throne. This document represented the last authentic expression of imperial will, and Zhao Gao made certain it was never sent. The eunuch understood that Fu Su's succession would mean his own destruction. The crown prince had opposed the policies that Zhao Gao had helped implement, had criticized the harshness that had made the eunuch valuable to the late emperor. A ruler guided by Confucian principles would have no use for a servant whose skills lay in surveillance and intimidation. Zhao Gao needed a different emperor, one who would need him. He approached Hu Hai first, appealing to the young prince's vanity and fear. Did Hu Hai wish to see his brother take the throne while he was relegated to insignificance? Did he imagine that Fu Su, once in power, would treat his siblings with kindness? The path to survival, Zhao Gao whispered, lay in seizing what circumstances had made available. The emperor was dead, and the letter summoning Fu Su had not yet been sent. Opportunities like this came once in 10,000 years. Hu Hai wavered, his conscience troubled by the enormity of what Zhao Gao proposed. Stealing the throne from his elder brother violated every principle of filial piety, every tradition of legitimate succession. But fear proved stronger than conscience. Hu Hai agreed. Li Si presented a more difficult challenge. The prime minister had served the first emperor for decades, had helped design the very system of laws that made the empire function. His loyalty to the throne was genuine, his reputation built on principles that the conspiracy would require him to abandon. Zhao Gao approached him, not with appeals to ambition, but with threats of destruction. If Fu Su becomes emperor, the eunuch argued, he will certainly appoint his own ministers. You will lose your position at best. At worst, you will lose your life. Your entire clan could be exterminated for the policies you helped create. But if Hu Hai takes the throne, your position is secure. The new emperor will need experienced administrators. He will need you. Li Si resisted, but not for long. The man who had advised burning books and burying scholars discovered that his own principles were negotiable when his survival was at stake. He joined the conspiracy. Together, the 3 men forged a new imperial edict. It condemned Crown Prince Fusu for disloyalty and failure, ordering him to commit suicide immediately. It similarly condemned General Meng Tian, whose loyalty to Fusu made him dangerous, and it designated Hu Hai as the new emperor, rightful heir to the throne of Qin. Messengers carried this forged document north to the frontier, where Fusu received it with the trust that his father's seal demanded. General Meng Tian urged caution. The edict's accusations made no sense. Its orders seemed designed to benefit someone other than the state. Its timing was suspicious. But Fusu's Confucian principles would not allow him to question his father's command. If the emperor ordered his death, then death was his duty. Fusu drew his sword and opened his own throat. The legitimate heir to China's first empire died because he was too honorable to suspect that the document commanding his death was a lie. Meng Tian proved less compliant. The general refused to kill himself until he understood why he had been condemned, demanding explanations that the conspirators could not provide without exposing their crimes. He was arrested and imprisoned, held in chains while Zhao Gao consolidated power in the capital. Eventually, when his continued existence became inconvenient, he was forced to swallow poison. The man who had commanded 300,000 soldiers and built the Great Wall died in a prison cell, victim of a eunuch's scheming. Hu Hai ascended the throne as Qin Ershi, the second emperor of Qin. He was 21 years old, utterly unprepared for governance, and entirely dependent on the men who had placed him in power. Zhao Gao became his chief minister in all but name, controlling access to the young emperor while systematically eliminating anyone who might challenge his influence. Li Si retained his position briefly, his usefulness not yet exhausted, his fate merely postponed. The second emperor proved to be everything his father had not been. Weak where Qin Shi Huang had been strong, indecisive where the first emperor had been resolute, cruel without purpose where his father's cruelty had at least served strategic ends. Zhao Gao encouraged his worst impulses, isolating him from honest counsel, while directing the apparatus of state terror against anyone the eunuch considered a threat. The empire that had been built through decades of careful planning began to unravel within months. The breaking point came in 209 BC, when a minor official named Chen Sheng found himself facing an impossible situation. He was escorting a group of conscripts to their military postings when heavy rains made the roads impassable. The law was clear: arriving late meant execution for everyone involved. Chen Sheng gathered the men under his command and posed a question that would echo through Chinese history. We face death if we continue, and death if we flee, he declared. Since we die either way, why not die fighting for something that matters? Kings and nobles are not born to their positions. They seize them through strength and daring. The rebellion that followed spread like fire through dry grass. Peasants who had been crushed by taxes and conscription rallied to Chen Sheng's banner. Former nobles from the conquered kingdoms saw an opportunity to reclaim what Qin had stolen. Soldiers who had been brutalized by the imperial system turned their weapons against it. Within weeks, what had begun as a desperate gamble by doomed men had become a general uprising that threatened the foundations of imperial power. Chen Sheng's rebellion was eventually suppressed, and the man himself was killed by his own followers. But the spark he had ignited could not be extinguished. Two leaders emerged from the chaos who would determine China's future. Jiang Yu, a nobleman from the former state of Chu, whose physical strength and tactical genius made him the most feared warrior of his generation, and Liu Bang, a peasant-born official whose common touch and political instincts would prove more valuable than martial prowess. In Xianyang, Zhao Gao moved against Li Si. The prime minister who had helped create the empire had outlived his usefulness, and his very competence made him a threat to a eunuch who thrived on dysfunction. Zhao Gao fabricated charges of treason, produced confessions extracted through torture, and convinced the second emperor that his most capable minister was plotting rebellion. Li Si was executed by the punishment he had helped design for others. Cut in half at the waist, his family exterminated to the third degree of relation. The architect of Qin law died by Qin law, a victim of the merciless system he had championed. With Li Si eliminated, Zhao Gao's power became absolute. He demonstrated this through an act of breathtaking audacity that would become proverbial in Chinese culture. Bringing a deer before the second emperor, he declared it to be a horse. Hu Hai, confused, pointed out that the animal was obviously a deer. Zhao Gao turned to the assembled ministers and asked each one to identify the creature. Those who said deer were later executed. Those who agreed with Zhao Gao that the animal was a horse survived. The test revealed who could be trusted to accept any lie the eunuch chose to tell, and eliminated anyone foolish enough to speak the truth. Pointing at a deer and calling it a horse became a Chinese idiom for political cowardice, for the corruption of truth by power, for the death of honesty in the face of tyranny. Xiang Yu's armies swept toward the capital, while Zhao Gao recognized that the dynasty he had corrupted was beyond saving. His solution was to eliminate the emperor he had created, replacing Hu Hai with a more pliable figurehead who might negotiate surrender on terms that preserved the eunuch's life. Zhao Gao's agents forced the second emperor to commit suicide, just 3 years after the conspiracy that had placed him on the throne. Ziying, a nephew of the first emperor, was elevated to rule what remained of the Qin state, no longer an empire, merely a kingdom facing annihilation. But Ziying proved more capable than Zhao Gao had anticipated. Within days of his elevation, he arranged the eunuch's assassination, executing the man whose schemes had destroyed the dynasty. It was too late to save the empire, but at least the architect of its destruction did not survive to enjoy the fruits of his treachery. Liu Bang's forces reached Xianyang first, accepting Ziying's surrender and promising to treat the population with mercy. The Qin dynasty officially ended in 206 BC, just 15 years after the first emperor had proclaimed that his line would rule for 10,000 generations. The dynasty that had unified China could not survive a single succession. Xiang Yu arrived afterward, furious that Liu Bang had claimed the prize of the capital's surrender. His response was characteristically excessive. He executed Ziying and the remaining Qin royal family, then set fire to Xianyang. The flames burned for 3 months, consuming palaces that had taken decades to construct, libraries that held the only copies of forbidden books, treasures gathered from across the conquered kingdoms. The Epang Palace, which the first emperor had never completed, was destroyed before it could ever serve its intended purpose. Whether Xiang Yu's fires reached the first emperor's tomb remains uncertain. The mausoleum lay outside the city, protected by its own fortifications, guarded by traps designed to kill intruders. Ancient sources suggest that grave robbers penetrated some of the outer chambers in the years of chaos that followed the dynasty's fall, but the central burial chamber may have remained intact, its mercury rivers still flowing, its bronze crossbows still armed, its clay army still standing eternal guard. For more than 2,000 years, the tomb kept its secrets. Dynasties rose and fell above the buried emperor: Han, Tang, Song, Ming, Qing, each building upon foundations that Qin Shi Huang had laid, while condemning the methods he had used to lay them. His name became synonymous with tyranny, his book burning and scholar burying cited as warnings against the abuse of power. Confucian scholars, whose intellectual ancestors he had tried to silence forever, wrote the histories that shaped how future generations would remember him. Then, in March 1974, farmers digging a well in Shanxi province struck something unexpected. Fragments of terracotta, pieces of ancient bronze, traces of a buried world that had waited 2 millennia to be rediscovered. Archaeologists descended on the site and began uncovering what would prove to be one of the most significant archaeological discoveries in human history. The terracotta army emerged from the earth in ranks and files, thousands of individual warriors frozen in eternal readiness. Each face was unique, each expression distinct, each figure a portrait of someone who had lived and died in the service of the first emperor's vision. Infantry soldiers stood alongside cavalry officers. Archers knelt in firing positions. Generals surveyed formations that had not moved in 22 centuries. The army that Qin Shi Huang had commissioned to protect him in death had survived to astonish the living. The main tomb chamber remains sealed. Modern technology has confirmed the presence of mercury in concentrations consistent with the ancient accounts of flowing rivers. Archaeologists have chosen to wait, developing preservation techniques that might protect whatever lies within from the damage that exposure could cause. The first emperor still guards his secrets, still resists intrusion, still refuses to surrender what he claimed for eternity. His legacy defies simple judgment. He was a tyrant who burned books and buried scholars, who worked hundreds of thousands to death on construction projects, who ruled through terror and demanded absolute obedience. He was also the unifier who ended centuries of warfare, who created administrative systems that would govern China for 2,000 years, who standardized the writing that allowed a vast and diverse population to communicate across regional boundaries. Every dynasty that followed him rejected his methods while building on his foundations. Every emperor who succeeded him condemned his example while benefiting from his achievements. The boy who was born a hostage in enemy territory, who survived assassination attempts and betrayals, who conquered 6 kingdoms and proclaimed himself the first of an eternal line. That boy became something that transcended his own mortality, not through the elixirs he sought or the tomb he built, but through the empire he created. China as a unified state, China as a concept that has endured through millennia of change, China as one of humanity's great civilizations. All of this traces back to the man who first imagined that such unity was possible and possessed the ruthlessness to make his imagination real. The Great Wall still stretches across the northern hills, rebuilt and restored, but following the path that Qin Shi Huang's conscripts first marked with their labor and their bones. The writing system he standardized still forms the basis of Chinese characters today. The centralized administrative state he created still echoes in Beijing's government ministries. The idea of China as a single, unified realm, which he first made real through conquest and terror, has become so fundamental that most people cannot imagine the alternative. In the silent darkness beneath Mount Li, surrounded by rivers of mercury and guarded by an army of clay, the first emperor waits. His body has long since returned to dust, but the empire he built endures. He sought immortality through magic and failed. He achieved it through history instead. 10,000 generations have not yet passed. But the name of Qin Shi Huang, the boy from Zhao who became the first emperor of China, will be remembered for as long as human memory survives.